We tend to sit back and we're always armchair quarterbacking the Chinese, and we're always trying to analyze and determine how they may react and whether or not, and this is a key question that's come out of the conflict in Ukraine, and we've asked about the Russian armed forces. Is the People's Liberation Army a learning institution? And what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is, do they have the ability to ingest the lessons that they're learning around the world from the rapid evolution of armed conflict? Do they have the ability to ingest those lessons and make the appropriate changes in their warfighting strategic doctrine, their operational doctrine, their political decision-making, and organizing their forces in order to meet the challenges that are being faced by this new challenge, okay? And again, the question, it comes out to something I said earlier in our session. The question is not so much whether the PLA is studying the lessons learned. I assure you, they most certainly are, and very intently. I used to tell my colleagues, when we still had mill-to-mill relations with the Chinese, they say, well, what do they know about my organization? And I'd respond, if it's on the internet, they've read it, backwards and forwards, up and down. If it's a war college paper, if it's a national security study, if it's a RAND study, if it's a Carnegie study, and it's online, they've read it. Okay, so they're assiduous students of the evolution of modern warfare. But again, that's not really the question here. The question here is whether or not the Chinese People's Liberation Army, and more importantly, the Chinese Communist Party, can apply the lessons learned to evolve their force accordingly. So listen, when it comes to the application of violence to achieve political ends, whether it's the People's Armed Police, that paramilitary force enforcing internal stability I talked about a little bit earlier, whether it's the Ministry of Public Security, National Police, practicing local law enforcement, or whether it's the People's Liberation Army confronting external threats to China, the Chinese Communist Party prioritizes political security. Okay? In this case, the security and survival of the Chinese Communist Party. And many people forget that the number one mission of the Chinese People's Liberation Army is defending and protecting the Chinese Communist Party, above all other missions. Each force, each of the three forces I talked about, is directly controlled by a national level party organ. So in the case of the People's Liberation Army, it's the Central Military Commission of the Communist Party of China, or the Ministry of Public Security, and so on and so forth. Centralized partisan political control of the state instruments of violence in China is the controlling principle. What did Mao say all those years ago? Politics flows out of the barrel of a gun. That said, I'm starting to wonder whether or not the PLA uniform leadership still believes that this is a viable model for 21st century warfare. Okay? We need to ask ourselves if the PLA and the Chinese Communist Party might have their own internal red versus expert conflict going on. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the party leaders, of course, are heavily in favor of keeping the current construct where the party controls the gun. Okay, and that's not surprising. But I'm wondering whether or not the Chinese military leadership feels that same way. I'm wondering whether or not they may feel a little hamstrung as they watch their colleagues in the Russian armed forces and the United States armed forces have the latitude to make decisions, particularly at the operational level of warfighting. Maybe not at the strategic level, although I would argue many of our combatant commanders have the ability to affect warfighting and to make decisions at the strategic level. And I wonder if whether or not they're questioning whether or not the party organs can move fast enough to make decisions during a rapidly evolving 21st century war. Over the last few years, we've wondered and analyzed Xi Jinping's dismissal of a number of generals, a number of ministers of defense, and other senior PLA officials, and we've attributed it to this never-ending anti-corruption campaign, and perhaps some other political dynamics going on within the party. But I'm starting to wonder whether or not this is as much a question of a difference of perspective in leadership as it is corruption. Xi has acknowledged that his force falls, his officer corps especially, falls short in some areas, especially in judging situations, understanding higher authorities, intentions, making operational decisions, deploying troops, and dealing with unexpected situations. Those five, he's even given them a name. He calls them the Wuge Buhui, the five incapables. That is, the five things his officer corps is incapable of doing. The question is, can the Chinese Communist Party strike a balance between encouraging the continued presence or the continued overwhelming role of the Communist Party in military decision-making while encouraging initiative and independent thinking necessary for 21st century warfare within their officer corps? And, I'm not going to answer that, but it's something we all need to think about. Can you square that circle? Can you balance those two things?